The Bible contains a genealogy of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 1, the most sacred list in the New Testament. The bloodline of the Son of God, traced from Abraham through David to the virgin birth. Generation after generation of patriarchs, kings, and faithful men. And in the middle of it, in verse 3, is the name of a woman, not a queen, not a prophetess, not a woman celebrated for her virtue or her faith or her service to God. A woman who disguised herself as a prostitute, who seduced her own father-in-law, who conceived children through an act of deception so scandalous that when Judah discovered what had happened, he ordered her burned alive. Her name was Tamar, and God put her in the bloodline of his son. This seems impossible. The genealogy of the Messiah contains a woman who committed what looks on the surface like one of the most morally reprehensible acts in the entire book of Genesis. A woman who sat at a crossroads, veiled like a cult prostitute, and waited for the man who had wronged her to walk past. A woman who kept the evidence of what she had done so that when judgment came she could produce it and say, "Look, whose seal and cord and staff these are." And Judah, the man who had wronged her, the man who was about to have her burned, looked at the evidence and said something that has echoed through 3,000 years of theological history. "She is more righteous than I." The man who had been wronged became the man who confessed. The woman who had been abandoned became the woman who was vindicated. The act that looked like sin became the act that saved a covenant line. And the child born from that act became an ancestor of the King of Israel and the King of Kings. How is this possible? The answer is not a comfortable one. It does not fit into a neat moral category. It does not resolve into a simple lesson about right and wrong. It is the story of a woman who was placed in an impossible situation by the failure of the men around her, who used the only means available to her, and who was ultimately declared righteous by the very man she had deceived. And it raises a question that the text is deliberately forcing you to sit with. What does it mean to be righteous when the systems designed to protect you have failed? Leave us 777 inches the comments if you are ready, because what you are about to hear will permanently change the way you read the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Before we can understand what Tamar did, we have to understand what was done to her, because her story does not begin with her deception. It begins with a series of failures by her husbands, by her father-in-law, by the very institution that was supposed to guarantee her future. Tamar enters the narrative in Genesis 38 as the wife of Er, the firstborn son of Judah. Is described in a single sentence. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. We are not told what did. The text does not elaborate. It simply says he was wicked and God killed him. And Tamar, who had done nothing wrong, who had simply married a man who turned out to be wicked, is suddenly a widow with no children and no security. In the ancient world, this was not merely a personal tragedy. It was an existential crisis. A woman's entire future, her social standing, her economic survival, her identity, all of it was tied to her husband and her sons. Without a husband, without children, without the protection of a family structure, a woman was among the most vulnerable people in society. She had no independent legal standing, no property rights, no means of support beyond the charity of relatives. But there was a system designed to address exactly this situation. Levirate marriage. The law that required a man to marry his dead brother's widow, to raise up children in the dead brother's name, to preserve the family line, and provide for the widow's future. It was not merely custom. It was obligation, sacred obligation, the duty of the living to the dead and to the vulnerable. Judah had another son. His name was Onan. And Judah tells Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." Onan goes to Tamar, but he refuses to fulfill the actual purpose of the union. The text says that whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. Onan wanted the physical relationship without the responsibility. He wanted what Tamar offered without giving her what she needed: a child, a future, security, the continuation of the family line. He was willing to use her and unwilling to protect her. And the Lord put him to death also. 2 husbands, both dead, both wicked in different ways. And Tamar is still childless, still vulnerable, still waiting for the protection the system promised her. Judah now has one remaining son, Shelah. And Judah is supposed to give Shelah to Tamar as her next husband. But something has shifted in Judah's thinking. He is afraid. 2 of his sons have died while married to this woman. The rational part of him says that cannot be coincidence. And so he tells Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he feared that he would die also, like his brothers. He sends her away, back to her father's house, to wait. And she waits. She waits while Shelah grows up. She waits while Judah's wife dies. She waits while Shelah reaches marriageable age, and nothing happens. No messenger, no offer, no fulfillment of the promise. Judah had no intention of giving her Shelah. He had decided, perhaps without ever fully articulating it to himself, that Tamar was bad luck, that she was somehow responsible for the deaths of his sons, even though the text has told us clearly that his sons were wicked and their deaths were their own fault. He had placed his fear above his obligation, his self-protection above her survival. He had sent her away with a promise he never intended to keep. And Tamar in her father's house, wearing the garments of widowhood, realized the truth. She had been abandoned. The system had failed her. The men who were obligated to protect her had failed her, and she was running out of time. Every year that passed was another year of her childbearing years gone. Every year was another year of the future she had been promised slipping further away. She was not going to wait anymore. What Tamar does next is one of the most audacious acts in the entire book of Genesis. And to understand it properly, we need to understand exactly what she did and what she understood about the situation she was in. She hears that Judah is going to Timnah to shear his sheep. She takes off her widow's garments, the clothes that marked her as a woman under Judah's obligation, the clothes she had been wearing faithfully, waiting for the promise he never intended to keep. She puts on a veil and wraps herself and sits at a place called Enaim, which means the open eyes or the place of seeing, on the road to Timnah. The veil is the key detail. In that culture, veils of a specific kind were associated with cult prostitutes, women who served at the shrines of pagan deities. A veiled woman sitting at a crossroads was a recognized sign. Judah sees her. He does not know who she is because she has covered her face, and he assumes she is a prostitute. He approaches her and proposes to pay her for her services. And here is where Tamar's plan reveals its extraordinary intelligence. She does not simply agree. She asks for a pledge, a guarantee that he will pay. And instead of asking for money, she asks for his seal, his cord, and his staff. Think about what these items were. In the ancient Near East, a man's seal was his personal identification. It was used to authenticate documents, to mark property, to sign agreements. It was the equivalent of a modern signature combined with a credit card and an identity document. His cord was the string from which the seal hung around his neck. His staff was the symbol of his personal authority and identity. She asked for everything that identified him as Judah. This was not a random request. This was a calculated move by a woman who understood exactly what she needed. She was not interested in money. Money could be denied, disputed, forgotten. But these items, they were irrefutable. They were proof that could not be argued with. Proof that bore his identity in its very material. Judah gives her what she asks for. He sleeps with her, and Tamar conceives. She returns home. She takes off the veil. She puts back on her widow's garments, and she waits again. But this time, she is not waiting with empty hands. Judah sends a friend to deliver payment and retrieve his pledge, but the friend cannot find the woman. He asks the people of the area, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim?" And they say there has been no cult prostitute here. Judah is embarrassed, but lets it go. He says, "Let her keep the items, lest we be laughed at." He writes off the pledge as the cost of an awkward situation and moves on. 3 months later, someone brings him a report. "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah, the man who had visited what he thought was a prostitute, the man who had abandoned his widowed daughter-in-law, the man who had failed in every obligation he owed to her, this man's immediate response is to demand her execution. Bring her out and let her be burned. This is the full weight of the double standard she was living under. The man who had just slept with someone he thought was a prostitute was ready to execute his daughter-in-law for becoming pregnant outside of marriage. The same act, different consequences. The same moral failure, different accountability. And then Tamar produces the evidence. She sends a message to Judah as she is being brought out to be burned. Please identify whose these are. The seal and the cord and the staff. The silence in the text between that message and Judah's response is one of the most dramatic silences in all of Scripture. He looks at the items. He recognizes them. Everything he has done, everything he has refused to do, everything he has been, it is all contained in those 3 objects. And he says, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." 5 words of confession. She is more righteous than I. Not she is forgiven, not her sin is excused. She is more righteous than I. He is not merely acknowledging that she acted from a legitimate grievance. He is making a moral comparison. And in that comparison, he comes out worse than the woman he was about to burn. Now we need to sit with the theological question that this story forces into the open, because it is deeply uncomfortable. Was what Tamar did right? The text does not answer this question with a simple yes or no. It answers it with Judah's confession. She is more righteous than I. This is a comparative statement, not an absolute one. It does not say what she did was good. It says that in the moral accounting of this situation, she comes out better than he does. His failure was greater than her failure. His refusal to fulfill his obligation was more culpable than her deception in response to that refusal. But there is more happening here than a simple moral comparison, because the text tells us the outcome of Tamar's act with a significance that goes far beyond the individual story. She gives birth to twin boys, Perez and Zerah, and it is through Perez that the line of Judah continues. The line that leads to David, the line that leads to Solomon, the line that leads through 1,000 years of kings and exiles and returns and prophets and suffering to the one born in Bethlehem. Matthew 1-3 lists it plainly. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, not despite Tamar, by Tamar. Her name is in the bloodline. Her act is in the bloodline. The child she conceived through deception and desperation is the ancestor of the King of Kings. This is what theologians call providence, the working of God's purposes through human action, including flawed, morally complicated, desperate human action. God did not cause Tamar to do what she did. He did not endorse every aspect of her method, but he worked through it. He took the act of a desperate woman who had been abandoned by every system designed to protect her, and he wove it into the fabric of the most important story ever told. This is the consistent pattern of the book of Genesis. Jacob deceives his father. Rahab lies to the soldiers. Ruth uses the customs of the harvest to approach Boaz. None of these are presented as flawless moral acts. All of them are woven into the covenant story. God writes straight on crooked lines. But Tamar's case is perhaps the most striking of all, because she is not simply woven into the story, she is praised. Judah's confession, "She is more righteous than I," is the moral verdict the text endorses, and she is named in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, which is not something Matthew does by accident. He names 5 women in that genealogy. Every single one of them has a story that involves moral complexity, cultural transgression, or social marginalization. Matthew is making a deliberate theological statement. The bloodline of the Messiah runs through the broken, the complicated, the overlooked, and the desperate. Not in spite of this, because of this. Because the God who became flesh was not coming to validate the successful and the virtuous. He was coming to the ones the system had failed. Tamar was one of those ones. Let us look at Tamar's character more carefully, because the text rewards this examination with a portrait of a woman of extraordinary intelligence, patience, and moral clarity. She was intelligent. Her plan was not impulsive. It was calculated. She knew Judah's root. She knew the cultural meaning of the veil and the crossroads. She knew exactly what evidence to ask for, not money, which could be denied, but personal identification items, which could not. She thought ahead to the moment of confrontation and prepared for it. This was not the action of a desperate woman acting blindly. It was the action of a woman who had thought through every step. She was patient. She had waited in her father's house for years, wearing widow's garments, waiting for a promise she was beginning to understand would never be fulfilled. She did not act until she had information, until she knew Judah was coming, until the moment was right. Her patience was not passivity, it was strategy. She was morally clear. She knew exactly what wrong had been done to her. She knew who was responsible. She did not misdirect her action or harm the innocent. Her target was the specific man who had the specific obligation she was owed and had refused to fulfill it. Every element of her plan was directed at the person who owed her what she had been denied. And she was brave. What she did could have gotten her killed. It very nearly did. When Judah ordered her burned, she was moments from death. And even in that moment, she did not simply produce the evidence immediately. She sent it as a message, "Please identify whose these are," giving Judah the opportunity to recognize what he had done and confess it without being forced. She gave him the chance to be the man he should have been, even at the moment when she held the power. This is not the behavior of a schemer or a manipulator in the pejorative sense. This is the behavior of a woman who understood justice, who pursued it with intelligence and courage, and who even in her moment of power treated the man who had wronged her with a kind of dignity. There is one more dimension of Tamar's story that the text preserves in a small detail that is easy to miss. When she gives birth, the midwife notices that one twin is trying to come out first. She ties a scarlet thread on his hand and says, "This one came out first." But then that baby draws his hand back and the other twin comes out first. And the midwife says, "What a breach you have made for yourself," and names him Perez, which means breach. The other twin, the one with the scarlet thread, is named Zerah, the scarlet thread. In a book where nothing is accidental, the scarlet thread on the wrist of the second-born son of Tamar cannot be read without hearing the echo of another scarlet thread in another critical moment. In Joshua 2, Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho, another woman of moral complexity, another woman in the genealogy of Jesus, hangs a scarlet thread from her window as the sign that will protect her household when Israel destroys the city. Two women, two scarlet threads, both in the bloodline of the Messiah, both marked by this color that the Bible associates with blood, with covenant, with the covering of sin. The thread that was supposed to mark the firstborn marked the secondborn instead. The covenant blessing goes not to the one who was marked, but to the one who broke through. Perez, the one who made a breach, becomes the ancestor of David and of Christ. Even the birth of Tamar's children is a breach of the expected order. The younger comes before the older. The one who is not marked receives the blessing. This is the pattern of Genesis from the very beginning: Jacob before Esau, Joseph over his brothers, the younger before the older, the unexpected before the expected. And here it plays out one more time, in the birth canal of a woman who was herself a breach of the expected order, who broke through the system that had failed her and made a way where there was none. Perez means breach. His mother was a woman who made a breach, and through that breach, through that desperate act of a woman who refused to accept abandonment as her final sentence, came the line that led to the one who would make the ultimate breach through death itself, into resurrection, into the new creation. There is a dimension of Tamar's story that almost never gets preached. It is the dimension that involves Judah himself, not as a villain, but as a man whose own transformation is as significant as Tamar's vindication. Judah is one of the most complex figures in the book of Genesis. He is the fourth son of Jacob and Leah. He is the brother who suggests selling Joseph into slavery rather than killing him, which sounds almost like mercy, until you realize he was the one who stopped the others from doing the slightly less terrible thing. He is the brother who steps forward years later in Egypt and offers himself as a slave in place of Benjamin, a genuine act of sacrificial courage that signals how much he has changed. But between the selling of Joseph and the offer in Egypt, there is Genesis 38, there is Tamar. And what happens in that chapter is the hinge point of Judah's transformation. When Judah says, "She is more righteous than I," this is not a minor admission of fault. This is a man who has had the full mirror of his own failures held up in front of him and has chosen not to look away. He could have denied it. He could have claimed the items were stolen or that he did not recognize his own seal. He could have had Tamar killed quickly before anyone examined the evidence too carefully. He had the power to do all of these things. He did none of them. He looked at the evidence, he recognized it, and he told the truth about what it meant. This is the beginning of the Judah who will stand before Joseph years later and say, "Take me instead of my brother." The man who was capable of selling his brother into slavery became the man who offered himself as a slave to protect his brother. That transformation did not happen in a single moment. It happened through a process, and Genesis 38 is part of that process. Tamar's act did not just secure her own future. It became an instrument in the moral formation of the man who would give his name to the most significant tribe in Israel, the tribe of Judah, the tribe of kings, the tribe from which the Messiah would come. She shaped him, without intending to, without knowing what he would become, simply by forcing him to face what he had done. This is one of the ways God works in human history that we most consistently miss. He does not only work through the heroic and the intentional, he works through the confrontational. Through the moment when someone refuses to let us escape our own failures, through the evidence held out by trembling hands that says, "Look at this. You cannot deny this. This is who you have been." Tamar was that moment for Judah. She was the mirror he could not avoid looking into. We also need to understand the Levirate law more deeply, because it is the entire legal and moral framework within which Tamar's story unfolds. Without understanding what Levirate marriage was and what it meant in the ancient world, the full weight of what Tamar was owed and what was taken from her cannot be felt. The word levirate comes from the Latin lever, meaning husband's brother. The practice is codified in Deuteronomy 25:5-10, though the Genesis narrative predates this formal codification, suggesting the practice was already customary in the patriarchal period. The law states that when brothers live together and one dies without a son, the dead man's wife shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife. The purpose of this law was threefold. First, it preserved the name of the dead man. Without sons, a man's name would disappear from Israel. The levirate child was counted as the dead man's heir, ensuring continuity of his family line. Second, it kept property within the family. In an agricultural society where land was the primary form of wealth and was tied to family identity through inheritance, keeping the widow within the family prevented the land from being transferred to another tribe or family. Third, and most importantly for Tamar's situation, it provided for the widow. A childless widow in the ancient world was among the most economically and socially vulnerable people imaginable. The levirate law was a structural guarantee of her survival. When Onan refused to fulfill this obligation, he was not merely making a personal choice about reproduction. He was deliberately depriving Tamar of her economic and social future while taking what she offered physically. The text's description of God killing him for this act reflects the gravity of the violation. This was not a minor breach of custom. It was a fundamental betrayal of the obligation owed to a vulnerable person. And when Judah sent Tamar back to her father's house with a false promise about Shelah, he compounded the failure. He was not merely postponing the obligation, he was effectively nullifying it while maintaining the appearance of fulfilling it. Tamar was in a legal and social limbo, not free to marry another man because she was technically still bound to Judah's house, but not actually being provided with the husband she was owed. She was trapped. The cruelty of this trap is something the modern reader may not feel fully, because we do not live in a world where a woman's survival depends entirely on her connection to a male household. But in Tamar's world, every year that passed in that trap was a year of her childbearing years gone. It was a year closer to the moment when she would be too old for any man to want her as a wife, too old to bear the children who would support her in old age, too old to have any future at all. She was not simply inconvenienced. She was being slowly destroyed, and the destruction was being carried out by a man who owed her protection. The 5 women of Matthew's genealogy deserve a section of their own, because understanding who they are and why Matthew chose to name them transforms the reading of the genealogy from a list into a theological manifesto. Matthew 1 names 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, referred to as the wife of Uriah, and Mary. In a genealogy that spans 42 generations and names dozens of men, the deliberate inclusion of 5 specific women is a statement. Genealogies in the ancient world did not typically include women at all. Their inclusion here is not accidental, it is intentional, and the women Matthew chose are not the obvious choices. If you were constructing a genealogy of the Messiah, and you wanted to include women to honor the female ancestors of Jesus, you would expect to see Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the mother of the promised line. You would expect to see Rebekah, the mother of Jacob. you would expect to see Rachel or Leah, the mothers of the 12 tribes. Matthew does not name any of them. He names Tamar, who disguised herself as a prostitute, Rahab, who was an actual prostitute in Jericho, Ruth, a Moabite woman, a foreigner from a nation that Israel was forbidden to intermarry with, according to Deuteronomy 23:3, Bathsheba, who was the wife of another man when David slept with her, and Mary, who was pregnant before her marriage in a way that her community would have interpreted as scandalous. Every single one of these women exists at a point of moral complexity, social transgression, or cultural marginalization. Every single one of them had a story that the respectable people of their time would have used to disqualify them from any role in the sacred history. And Matthew puts them in the bloodline of the Son of God. The theological statement is unmistakable. The Messiah was not coming from a line of the pure and the uncontroversial. He was coming from a line of the complicated, the desperate, the foreign, the morally ambiguous, and the socially marginal. His bloodline was not a monument to human virtue. It was a monument to divine grace working through imperfect human reality. This is not a minor point. It is one of the most significant things the Gospel of Matthew communicates in its very first chapter. Before Jesus has done anything, before he has preached a word or healed a person or died and risen, the genealogy tells you who he is and who he came for. He came for the Tamars, the Rahabs, the Ruths, the ones the system failed, the ones the respectable community would rather not mention. And if you are sitting with a story that feels too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too far outside the lines of what you think God could possibly work through, Matthew 1-3 is your answer. Tamar. By Tamar, your name could be there too. The birth narrative of Perez and Zerah contains one final detail that is worth dwelling on. The twin who was supposed to be born first pulled his hand back, and the twin who broke through first was named Perez breach. And it is through Perez, the one who made the breach, that the line continues. This pattern of the unexpected breakthrough, the one who was not supposed to come first coming first, the one who was not marked receiving the blessing, this is woven through the entire fabric of Genesis. It is there in Jacob and Esau where the younger receives the blessing meant for the older. It is there in Joseph and his brothers where the one who was sold into slavery becomes the one who saves them all. It is there in Perez and Zerah where the marked hand pulls back and the unmarked one breaks through. And it reaches its culmination in the resurrection. The one who was supposed to stay dead did not stay dead. The one the system executed broke through the ultimate barrier. The one who was marginalized, condemned, buried, he made the ultimate breach. Perez means breach. Jesus means the Lord saves. And the line from one to the other runs straight through Tamar, the woman who was failed by every system, who was nearly executed, who had nothing left except intelligence and desperation and the knowledge of what she was owed, who made a breach in the wall of her own abandonment, and through that breach, eventually, came the one who makes all breaches possible. Tell me in the comments, does Tamar's story change how you read the genealogy of Jesus? Does it change how you think about righteousness? If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their complicated story is not disqualifying. Subscribe for more explorations of the biblical figures the church has reduced to footnotes when they were actually the point. Until next time, there is one final thing worth saying about Tamar before we close. Something about the way she is remembered, or rather, the way she is not remembered, that tells us something important about how the church has read its own text. Tamar is in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, She is one of 5 women named in the most sacred list in the New Testament. She is praised by the man who wronged her as more righteous than himself. She is the mother of the line that leads to David, to Solomon, and to the Messiah. And most Christians have never heard a sermon about her. She appears in children's Bibles only if the story has been so sanitized it barely resembles the original. She is mentioned in passing in surveys of the patriarchal narratives, usually as a footnote to the story of Judah. She is the woman in the veil at the crossroads, the uncomfortable detail that preachers skip over because it is easier to move from the selling of Joseph to the prison to the palace without stopping to ask what happened in chapter 38. But chapter 38 is there for a reason. It is not an accident of editing. It is not a document that got inserted in the wrong place. It sits between the selling of Joseph into slavery and the beginning of Joseph's story in Egypt, precisely because it is part of the same theological argument, the same argument about human failure and divine faithfulness, the same argument about who gets included in the covenant story and why. The selling of Joseph showed us Judah at his worst. Genesis 38 shows us the process of his transformation. Genesis 44 shows us Judah at his best. The arc of his moral development is the arc of the book of Genesis in miniature. And Tamar is the pivot point. Remove Tamar from the story and Judah's transformation has no explanation. The man who sold his brother and the man who offered himself in his brother's place are connected by what happened at a crossroads on the road to Timnah, when a veiled woman asked for his seal and his cord and his staff. She changed him, without intending to, simply by refusing to disappear. This is Tamar's final lesson. Not merely the lesson about justice, or about the God who works through broken situations, or about the genealogy of grace, but the lesson about what happens when a person who has been wronged refuses to accept that wrong as the final word. She could have stayed in her father's house. She could have grown old in widow's garments, waiting for a promise that would never come, and simply disappeared from the story. No one would have blamed her. The system said, stay. The culture said, wait. The man with the power said, there is nothing you can do. She did not disappear. And because she did not disappear, because she made her breach, because she held out the seal and the cord and the staff and said, look at this, because of all of that, Perez was born. And through Perez, David. And through David, the one who made the ultimate breach, through the wall of death itself. Every person whose story feels too complicated for God to use should sit with that chain of events, from a desperate woman at a crossroads to the resurrection of the dead, from a veil and a deception and a moment of terrible courage to the genealogy of the Son of God. God wrote it into the record deliberately. He put her name in Matthew 1-3 deliberately. He made sure we would have to say her name every time we read the ancestry of Jesus. Tamar. By Tamar, she would not disappear, and neither should you.